A few years ago, I made a documentary on John Hume, a man I admire greatly. I'd reported on his role in bringing peace to Northern Ireland, and I'd also witnessed many of the worst moments of the Troubles, which blighted these islands for 30 years. Hume had a lifelong commitment to non-violence and the civil rights campaigns of Martin Luther King. So now I want to understand how protests in Ireland, America and around the world came to such a violent and devastating peak in one single year, 1968. As a child, I was glued to our television, watching the events unfold which shaped our world. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, student riots in Berlin, Mexico and Paris, the Prague Spring and the height of anti-Vietnam protests, all played out on TV, where local issues could become global in an instant. And when I ended up here in UCD some years later to study law, it was said even then that these steps were designed so that students couldn't riot and congregate. Such was the fear of a global protest movement spreading. Perhaps it's too easy to see 1968 as a worldwide year of idealism and protest. In many ways, the events of that year are totally unconnected. But at the heart of it are human stories, discrimination and oppression, and a sense that people weren't going to take it anymore. That's certainly true about what happened in Derry. In Northern Ireland's second city, the focus for years had been on jobs, voting rights and housing. Poor families were living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. And basically, if you didn't own your property, you had no vote. If you did, and you owned a business, you could have 2 votes. And very few Catholics owned a house, let alone a business. But housing allocation was under the control of the City Corporation, which had a permanent unionist majority.
This is Derry. The North Ward has 8 unionist councillors, the South Ward has 8 nationalist councillors, and the Waterside Ward 4 unionist councillors.
Confining the Catholic vote to certain parts of the city or gerrymandering meant the Unionist Party had just 1/3 of the votes, but 60% of the seats.
Catholics here are faced with blatant social injustice in the form of gerrymander, in the form of discrimination. And this forces moderate people into immoderate actions.
Up until the 1960s, there was an air of resignation among Catholics in Northern Ireland that this was how it was always going to be. But then the UK free education system created a whole new generation who were smart, they were educated and they were politicised. People like John Hume, doctors, lawyers, teachers, students, who could all see the inequality and the living conditions on their streets, and they were prepared to stand up and to do something about it. Some of the earliest protests were sit-ins here in Derry's Guildhall. One of the angry young men involved had just come home from London to visit his family.
We had a number of sit-ins, and the biggest and most effective sit-in was by homeless families themselves. These were local, decent, hard-working people with families with them who have been deprived of houses, partly because, not the only reason, but part of the reason they have been deprived of houses is that they were Catholics. Now, that's just an outrageous thing to happen, Under the system in Derry Corporation, the mayor allocated the houses. So if the mayor was a unionist, and it always was a unionist mayor, you had to convince this mayor. And so I can remember being with my mother, sort of in the foyer of this building. I remember her saying to the mayor, "Please, Mr. Anderson, we've been on the housing list for almost 20 years." Now, it was that daily pin-pricking humiliation that a lot of people felt. Like I would have felt growing up. Not that there was a revolutionary fervour about it, because there was a certain degree, a sense of futility, a sense of inevitability. I mean, it was about economic things. At the heart of the early civil rights movement was discrimination in housing, was discrimination in jobs.
Northern Ireland certainly didn't have segregation laws, but many issues in 1960s Alabama were surprisingly similar. Second-class citizens subjected to housing and job discrimination, and a stubborn determination to prevent black citizens exercising their right to vote. Here in Selma, effectively less than 1% of the black population had that right, and there was still segregation. Different seats in restaurants, different entrances to hospitals and doctors' surgeries, even different entrances into churches. For instance, at this Tabernacle Baptist Church, there were 2 entrances, one on Main Street, but because black people weren't allowed on the Main Street, they had to go in through the side entrance. Charles, remind people what segregation was like in somewhere like Selma, Alabama.
Segregation was denial of your citizenship. We were not allowed to go to the white schools. We weren't even allowed to go to the white hospital. We were given second-handed books. There were 2 water fountains, one for whites and one for, quote, coloreds.
Just like Charles was saying, you couldn't go to public bathrooms. You couldn't eat in restaurants. I remember we had this Dairy Queen was right downtown, and the white people could go in and sit down. Well, they had a window about this big where you had to go to as a black person.
Peggy, tell me about the segregation you remember.
One of the scariest times in my life was that the KKK would burn a cross in the backyard over from where we lived, so we could plainly see it. But our parents would protect us by having us go in the closet. And I remember my dad getting his gun out while the cross would burn. So it was really kind of horrifying.
Alabama was part of the southern heartland of black slavery. In its capital, Montgomery, I met with civil rights lawyer and campaigner Brian Stevenson, who many regard as a modern-day successor to Martin Luther King.
This building is on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved people would be held. 100 meters up the street is where the slave auctions took place. And the legacy of slavery shaped this community. There were 2/3 of the people living here in 1860 were enslaved black people. And the modern civil rights movement began here in Montgomery when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, and a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. took up this call for resistance, for challenging segregation. And that movement pushed our nation to do some things that many people thought it would never do: give black people the right to vote, tear down these laws that sanction segregation and racial hierarchy. And for me, that's ultimately what happens when communities that feel abused and mistreated and oppressed, you get to the point where you're so burdened by the oppression that you have no choice but to speak out, but to fight. Sometimes people think, oh, you're doing that to be provocative, you're doing that to do something disruptive, and they don't appreciate that you don't feel like you have a choice. Sometimes you have to stand up, even when people are saying, sit down. Sometimes you have to speak, even when people are saying, be quiet.
The lesson being learned from America, even in a small corner of Ireland, was that there was a time to stand up and speak out. And sometimes small moments spark great change. In the village of Caledon in County Tyrone, 250 people, mostly Catholic, had been on the public housing waiting list for years. So when 15 new houses were built here at Kennard Park in late 1967, hopes were high. But only one went to a Catholic family. So 2 families on the waiting list decided to protest and to squat in the unfinished houses.
So we went into the house during the night, Fran and myself and 2 children, and I was pregnant with my 3rd. And we were sitting in rubble or whatever when the workmen arrived in the morning. And of course they told us we had to get out of there. And we said no. So they got the police and all. And when they came, they said, well, the house hadn't been broken into. The door was open, so they couldn't do anything about it.
It took 6 months for the local Unionist Council to prepare its next step against the two squatting families.
They arrived, the bailiffs, on the 18th of June with the crowbars and the sledgehammers, and they tried to talk us into going out. But we weren't going to go peaceably, and that was it. We were forcibly thrown out. My baby was 7, 8 weeks and dragged out.
Were you upset?
I was upset and I was angry.
What made it worse was that when they were evicted, the house beside them, number 9, was allocated to a 19-year-old unmarried girl. Now, of the 269 or so people on the waiting list, probably the person less neat.
When we heard a 19-year-old unmarried girl, you couldn't believe it. You couldn't have made it up. So then that's when my brother and Joe Campbell and Austin Curry decided, well, they would squat in her house. And that really brought the whole thing to a head.
We got the poker from Mrs. McQuaid, went round the back of the house, and the three of us held the poker and smashed the window. Then we barricaded the door and the windows, and we waited.
Austin got his wife to get the press, and they got the coverage then, and it was only a very short time, but it worked. And the fact that he was an MP did highlight it.
It was good television and good press because it was like evictions from the famine times. And it received a lot of publicity, which was the purpose of the exercise.
Around the world, as 1968 unfolded as a year of visible public protest, it was becoming painfully clear that when you challenge the status quo or stand up for the rights of a minority, the majority can feel threatened and fearful, and often fight back. There's no more poignant sense of that than here at the King Centre for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He'd been in Memphis to lend his support to sanitation workers in their struggle for better pay and conditions. Within days, there were riots in hundreds of cities, thousands were injured, and tens of thousands were arrested. Then in June, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated while campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination. The courage required to stand up peacefully and speak out against injustice of any kind was having real and horrific consequences. I grew up in a world shaped by those events and by those brave enough to stand up and be counted. But I can never appreciate the personal sacrifices endured by people like Kerry Kennedy, daughter of Robert F. Kennedy, who now heads a human rights organisation founded in his name. What do you think the legacy of your father is, his lasting legacy?
You know, I think the thing to remember about Daddy was really his moral imagination, his ability to understand things from the other person's perspective. And I think that's what allowed my father, after Dr. Martin Luther King died, when he addressed a crowd in the largest African-American neighborhood in Indianapolis, some of whom were ready to riot. And Daddy got up in front of that crowd and said, for those of you who are angered at the injustice of this act, I can say I've had that same feeling because a member of my family was killed by a gun. And you just imagine a politician standing up in front of a crowd about to riot and saying, I understand your feelings. Wow.
A few blocks away in New York, I met a man who was just 14 when Martin Luther King was shot and who personally knows the risks of standing up for basic civil rights.
It is not easy. You're going to be controversial. I've been stabbed leading a peaceful march. I've been incarcerated. I did 90 days in jail one time for a peaceful demonstration in Puerto Rico. I did several other times 30 days. But you know what's more difficult than not standing up? And that is if you have this compelling feeling to stand up and you don't stand up. I'd rather go through the brickbats out there than the internal turmoil of not doing what I know is right and what I believe I was born to do. So I've slept in jails at peace rather than sleep at home in torment.
Being for peace is anything but passive. It's an extraordinarily courageous stance to take, that you can punch me in the face and I won't punch back. You can arrest me and I'm going to go limp, but I'm not going to fight back. And it takes a heart full of love to be able to do that.
Emboldened by events in America, the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland decided to up the ante. For the first time ever, in the spirit of Dr. King, they planned a march for August of 1968. Not the 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery, but just 4 miles from Coal Island to Dungannon. It attracted almost 2,000 people, including a 21-year-old psychology student with little interest in politics.
I went on that march because it was an opportunity to meet up with school friends I'd gone to school with in Dungannon. So nothing was further from my mind than getting on a civil rights bus and changing the world. Nothing.
Loyalists organised a counter-protest here in Market Square in the hope that the Civil Rights March would be banned. Ultimately, the RUC had to draw up a protective cordon between the two protests. From the very beginning, the authorities' reaction to the civil rights campaign was not always to ban their protests, but to ghettoise them. The Dungannon March was ordered to end in the Catholic part of the town because the Unionist counter-protesters had gathered in their town square. After Dungannon, a decision was made to have another march in October, this time in Derry. Barely a mile from the train station across the River Foyle and into the walled city towards the Diamond, a bastion of unionism. There was no way the authorities were going to let that happen. They were convinced the movement was just a front for the IRA, socialists and communists. The civil rights movement was full of groups and individuals with their own agendas and end games. But right from the outset, there was no mention of the border or a united Ireland. It was simply demanding voting and housing rights for people treated as second-class citizens. And here in Derry, they were mostly Catholics. How would you describe the broad coalition that was the Northern Ireland civil rights movement?
I think you can pretty much describe it as everyone who's in opposition to the Unionist government, which gives you an idea about why there were so many tensions. So you've got the Nationalist Party, you've got the Communist Party, you've got the Republican movement, you've got left-wing Labour supporters, you've got Liberals. There's a huge range of people involved in it.
William Craig, Home Secretary in Stormont at the time, kept saying CRA, Civil Rights Association, CRA equals IRA. And that was pumped out day after day. Don't listen to these people. They're not out to help you or to anybody but Republicans and the Republican community, as they call it even at that stage. And that was in many ways a self-fulfilling thing. I mean, if you dub something, a front for the IRA and keep saying it, and then we have to keep denying it, that becomes part of the mainstream conversation.
The police believed this was a Republican insurgency. That is what their own Home Affairs Minister had told them. And people did gather to Paisley. People did believe this idea that this was in some ways a papal conspiracy, or that it was the communists. They didn't seem to know for sure, or even agree among themselves, what the dark evil forces behind us were. But they were confident there was something.
Surely a march for civil rights and housing is a reasonable object to demonstrate about.
It's a reasonable object, but it depends on who is planning the demonstration, who's actually involved in it. And as far as most people are concerned, this is essentially a Republican Nationalist Front organization.
Northern Ireland had been created almost 50 years earlier as a unionist province, and there was no way on God's earth that the citadel in Stormont was going to be threatened by what they saw as a bunch of lefties, Republicans and communists out in the wild west of Ulster.
We're going to carry this battle to every end of this province until the day shall come when the Union Jack shall fly on every street and on every road.
By the end of the summer of 1968, the civil rights campaign was spreading, but its epicentre was still local, right here in Derry. Could there have been simply a local solution? The unionist power seemed either unwilling or unable to accept the scale of the problem. And I think that is what connects Derry in Northern Ireland to the global 1968 movement. Short-sightedness, completely underestimating the scale of anger at the way things were, ignoring the suffering of ordinary, decent citizens, forgetting the basic human concepts of decency, equality, and dignity. Just as here in America or on the streets of Prague or Paris, that short-sighted inability of the authorities to see that the times they were changing was about to descend into chaos. In the 1960s, what connected civil rights movements around the world was not protesting, but visible protesting.
So let freedom ring.
In August 1963, 250,000 people gathered here in Washington for Martin Luther King's March for Jobs and Freedom. It's where he gave his I Have a Dream speech. Within a year, as a direct result, Washington had passed a Civil Rights Act. In contrast, a few years earlier, it took just one woman, Rosa Parks, to hold her nerve and refuse to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Alabama to a white man. And again, within a year, the law on segregated buses was changed. For those civil rights activists watching in Northern Ireland, they could see that visible, peaceful protest, big or small, worked. In Derry, at the beginning of 1968, protests about appalling housing conditions in the city started small. One of the toughest cases was of the Wilson family, who were reduced to living in a caravan in which one of their newborn children had just died. So, in protest on a cold February morning, local activists dragged the caravan and plonked it right here in the middle of this road, blocking all the traffic.
About 15 of us were involved, maybe 20, and it was decided to pull the caravan out into the main carriageway through the box, out onto the Lecky Road, and to keep it there for 24 hours. At the end of the 24 hours, I'd say there were about 150 people around the caravan. So we had elements of the local establishment, particularly the nationalist establishment, realising that there was something happening here.
8 months later, in October of 1968, the civil rights leaders were more media aware. They knew their protest in Derry needed a higher public profile. So they planned to march across the river from the train station to the Diamond, in the heart of loyalist Londonderry. The crucial thing was that this wasn't just simply a march. It was going to go through this gate to enter into the traditional loyalist stronghold, the walled city. It wanted to provoke reaction. In Northern Ireland, unionists saw the civil rights marches in black and white terms, a Republican front for an all-out attack on them, not a protest, but a provocation. For years in America, Martin Luther King and others understood that power of protest and provocation. If you dare stand up for your rights, you threaten those who think they will lose some of theirs. The 5-day-long march planned from Selma in early 1965, led by future Senator John Lewis, was meant to bring the campaign for black voting rights through some of the most racist towns in America and to Alabama's capital, Montgomery. When the marchers got to the brow of this high bridge, it was only then that they saw what was waiting for them on the other side. No man's land. This was the border between city and county. And the county sheriff had gathered troopers and a vigilante posse of angry white males. But the marchers carried on with the conviction of their non-violent protest. Sadly, it became this town's Bloody Sunday.
I went up to the pinnacle of the bridge and I saw the state troopers and the possemen with their billy clubs, their horses, their tear gas masks on. We marched down past the foot of the bridge and were confronted by the state troopers. They had a line of state troopers crossing the highway. And Hosea Williams and John Lewis were in the front of the line.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
Colonel Cloud said, "You have 3 minutes to disperse. This is a legal gathering. Go back to your homes or your church." The state troopers took their billy clubs, pushed us into a pack, and then I remember hearing John Lewis's head crack. They hit him over the head and gave him a concussion that almost killed him. After that, they threw tear gas into the crowd, and if you've ever been in tear gas, it makes you implode almost. There's nothing you can do except fly away. You have to get out of it.
It was horrifying. I wasn't expecting the violence that happened on Bloody Sunday. And so when they start bringing people into the church, it was like, oh my God. And so we immediately start wiping the blood and everything. And I was on my way next door to see if they had some towels, and I saw my dad. My dad was not in the movement. And he called me and begged for me to come to him. And I said, "Hi, Daddy." And he said, "Get in the car." He said, "Get in the car." It was his tone. And I got in the car, and he had the gun on his seat of the car. And he said, "I don't want to have to kill anybody today." And he took me home.
How much did it mean, Kirk, that march was filmed so the rest of the world could see what was happening in Selma?
Well, at that time, we didn't know that we were being filmed. You know, we were running to get away from the horses and the police that were chasing us. When you're running for your life, you don't look around and see, well, let me see what camera I'm on.
It was a national outrage and an international outrage. And I think those television scenes really completely changed the way Americans viewed the brutality of the South and what African Americans were up against. And I think that it had an impact not only on our own country, but around the world.
There's no doubt that what happened on that bridge in Alabama on the 7th of March 1965 reverberated around the world. And then, 3 years later, in October 1968, those echoes were heard in Derry.
October the 5th was the pivotal moment. It was a plot point in the whole narrative of Northern Ireland history. It turned in another direction. They talked about Alabama. I remember saying that when we all looked at the television and saw black people being clubbed in the United States, we knew what side we were on. We didn't have to analyse what's going on here. We knew we were on the side of the people against the police.
If they come along peacefully to march, are you going to strengthen the number of police? Are you going to give stronger powers to the police to make sure that a legal march can be held?
I am certainly going to do all that I can to strengthen the police and strengthen the law if necessary to see that a lawful march that's not likely to provoke a breach of the peace can take place.
Any person who wishes to parade.
I heard the Chief of Police read the Riot Act, and I remember thinking, That's crazy. I didn't know the Riot Act was a real thing.
We are demanding homes, employment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
The plan was to march from the train station along Duke Street to cross the river into the walled city. You knew you were provoking reaction. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, to some extent we were deliberately provoking sort of the police. It would be putting it a bit strong to say that you would go out in a demonstration, I mean, hoping sort of that there would be a police attack on it, but the possibility of a police attack on it was not something which deterred us from doing it. We didn't believe it should. So in that sense, we were, I suppose, playing a somewhat dangerous game.
RUC police officers had gathered at either end of Duke Street, corralling the protesters, and tensions mounted.
Then the whole thing disintegrated.
I didn't know what to do when the pushing and shoving between police and demonstrators turned into placards being thrown at fists being used and the cops using batons.
Please, God save us all!
As in Selma and in Paris, it wasn't the violence alone that put this bloody march down in history, it was the images of it. Right here on this street, RT cameraman Gay O'Brien was bravely filming right in the middle of it all.
One of the things I remember most about today is that the cops didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were doing.
But it was more than cock-up, it was gross incompetence. People say, oh, the black bastards of the RUC were like the gendarmes in France. They weren't at all. They were big country louts, you know. They were men who thought they had a kind of patriarchal authority just by their bearing, that if their uniform was clean and that their peak cap straight, they could look you straight in the face and tell you what to do. That's the type of men they were.
It's a loss of innocence. You can't not know the things that you find out. After the 5th of October, you couldn't look at the RUC and forget that that had happened. You couldn't say, oh, that was an aberration.
I can remember going back home, and there it was, on the national news. I sat down and looked at it. Good God!
We saw the television, and we said, right, we've done it. We've done it. It cannot be ignored in Britain or anywhere.
I knew that something very significant had changed in Derry, but the fact this change was being observed by millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world, that was a sort of validation in itself. And perhaps sort of in a rather pathetic way, as we were pleased to have been included in the roll call of revolution around the world. And so I said, bah, we're not doing anything small. We're part of something huge.
The world is looking at the problems of this city after the events of the past 4 days. At least 80 people have been treated in hospital since police broke up last Saturday's banned civil rights march.
I thought we were making progress, but I'm afraid this indicates a very definite setback. And in the meantime, all of us must conduct ourselves to avoid public disorder.
Would you take the same action again?
I would, quite definitely.
What I think was the key legacy of that day here in Derry, and what unites all those protests across the world, is trust, or more accurately, the breakdown in trust. The moment when you see or realise that the police, who are meant to protect you, are actually attacking you with batons, water cannon, or even bullets. After the shock of October the 5th in Derry, there were moments of, if not calm, at least compromise. Civil rights protesters were eventually allowed to cross the Craigavon Bridge and march through the walls of Derry into the Diamond. But these political compromises were also seen by some as surrender, and simmering hooligan elements were becoming more evident on all sides. And the issues were mobilising protests across the province. On October the 9th, 2,000 people here in Belfast marched towards City Hall in protest at the police brutality they'd witnessed in Derry. But the march was blocked by a counter-demonstration led by Ian Paisley. So the students decided to sit down right here in the middle of Linenhall Street in protest.
In a sense, many of us felt that taking part in the parade at that time was an act of responsible citizenship. You know, we were well-behaved, good people. You know, we didn't want to riot. Nobody wanted to riot.
Anyone who is prepared to risk violence is both irresponsible and even more ignorant than the people who are doing this.
The leaders of this march, being young students, say we are going to sit down. This is new. This is more like what we see on the TV. And hell, we are going to sit here peacefully until the police allow us through, or hell freezes over. Hell froze over in 35 minutes. And I was raging.
I appeal to you all as reasonable people to turn round and march back. Now turn right round and go back! Go back to Queen's University where we came from.
Rather than provoke another riot, the students retreated, convened a meeting and formed a new protest organisation, People's Democracy. Radical, youthful, idealistic and globally aware.
I find that People's Democracy meeting liberating in a strange way. This was now beginning to look more like the Sorbonne and Berlin and Belgium and Mexico, because now this was large numbers of students.
Across the world, popular protest was being seen to work and unpopular leaders were being seen to crumble. In the face of anti-Vietnam protests, President Johnson decided not to run for re-election, which is why Robert F. Kennedy was on the campaign trail when he was assassinated. In France, Charles de Gaulle briefly fled the country during the Paris riots. And in Northern Ireland, the man in charge and responsible for controlling the growing civil rights protests was the Unionist Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill. O'Neill was under pressure from London to make some concessions to try and resolve the voting rights and housing issues. But he was also under equal pressure from his own kind. For them, there could be no surrender, no compromise, no concessions to the existing status quo. It would be weak to be seen to give in to what they regarded as Republican or communist demands.
Terence O'Neill recognises after the 5th of October how serious things are. He says his policies are lying in the gutter. He talks about how dangerous it is with the British government becoming more involved and what's happening on the streets. And so the first cabinet meeting he holds, he says we need to have a really big reform package. And his rivals in the cabinet, Craig and Faulkner, immediately block it. Now, they're not kind of authoritarian and right-wing necessarily. They are prepared to have socio-economic reform. What they're not prepared to do is have constitutional and political reform. And the concern that O'Neill has is if you don't get that, particularly one man, one vote, then you're in a situation in which the streets are not going to be satisfied and Britain is not going to be satisfied.
It's not simply one man, one vote. It means one family, one house, one man, one job.
If they had given us the civil rights demands, if you like, at the beginning, rather than said, OK, you know, we're going to build more houses and distribute them carefully. There's going to be no more discrimination in jobs. Catholics will be able to get jobs in Derry, Guildhall. If any unionist had said that explicitly, you know, I think it would have changed the situation sort of in Derry quite dramatically and fundamentally. But the unionist government was right-wing and sectarian and all those things, but most of all, it was the stupidest regime in Europe.
In November of 1968, and under increasing pressure from Westminster, O'Neill did manage to issue some reforms, including a housing commission and an ombudsman to investigate discrimination. But the one thing not on the table, the vital issue from Alabama to the Bogside, was one man, one vote. So the protests and the strikes and the volume of protest became more constant, more insistent, until Captain Terence O'Neill, in a time of great strife, was forced to be Churchillian.
Ulster stands at the crossroads. I believe you know me well enough by now to appreciate that I am not a man given to extravagant language. But I must say to you this evening that our conduct over the coming days and weeks will decide our future. And I ask you now, with all sincerity, to call your people off the streets.
In a spirit of generosity, the more moderate Derry activists agreed to a ban on all marches for a month. But the more radical factions within the People's Democracy called for a 4-day protest march from Belfast to Derry, starting on January the 1st, 1969. It was to be modelled completely on Martin Luther King's Long March from Selma to Montgomery. There had actually been 3 Selma marches. The first ended within minutes in bloodshed. The second, led by Martin Luther King, walked to the bridge, knelt and prayed, and then returned to their church. The third walked the full 50-odd miles to the capital, Montgomery, but only because the US president had guaranteed their protection using the National Guard. It took them 5 days to get to the steps of the state capitol. When Dr. King got to Montgomery, he said, "The end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society at ease with its conscience." I know you are asking today, how long will it take? I come before you this afternoon to say, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long. Northern Ireland's Long March started in darkness on the morning of January the 1st, 1969. Unlike Alabama, there was no symbolic turning back. There was no protection from the army. From the beginning, they were the target of a small number of loyalist counter-demonstrators who walked ahead of them with a Union Jack and the red hand of Ulster.
It's telling that the Long March was modelled on Selma, and Martin Luther King is very explicit about what Selma is about. Selma is about confronting injustice. Selma is about bringing tensions to the surface. And he talks about how token marches, which don't have that confrontation, are not going to have any impact. He says he's learned that from bitter experience. So if you're taking that on board, there's clearly a provocative element, deliberately provocative element.
What was it we did that provoked? We walked up the main road. So again, there were Selma parallels. We took the main road as opposed to the dirt road where we were allowed to walk. That march was permitted, therefore we had the right not only to walk the road, but the right to have that procession protected by the forces of the state.
The route from Belfast to Derry, with about 80 RUC police for protection, marched through staunchly loyalist areas, and it did provoke. But their principle was to keep going towards the city, which had started the entire year of civil rights protests. The fourth and final day of the march was to lead them into Derry. And with 7 miles to go, they arrived here at Burntollop Bridge. An ambush lay in wait for them.
There is a good possibility of some stones being thrown. Some people may be hurt. However, police have said they are quite prepared to get us through this obstacle.
Police told us there is going to be an attack. It's up to you whether you want to go ahead or not, whether you want to get to Derry or not. And everybody realised that something bad was going to happen. But we decided no. Derry was, as in America, in Selma, Montgomery, Derry was the epicenter of the sectarianism, everything that we were marching against. We had to get there, so we thought, no, we're going, and on we marched. We were in like a ravine. There were 200 or so with sticks and cudgels. There was no way out for us. Police stood back. Bricks came hailing down, iron bars, stones. It was kind of scary. Some of the women in particular had somehow got lost in the river, and the attackers followed them and were beating them with sticks.
There were points on that march when I was petrified. Burntollop particularly. I was frightened that people might drown in the river. I wanted to go back to pick those people up. The march needed to go on.
Actually, you thought we mightn't get out of this. We might be beaten to death here. And you literally were trapped, so you just had to run, run, run and get away.
I've no doubt, even to this day, that the policy was let them march and let them take their hiding. They'll have manners when they're finished.
When the marchers finally approached Derry, they were met with something unexpected.
So when we came into Derry, I can remember vividly hundreds of people running towards us. They were from the Bogside. That was the moment when a mass of people associated themselves with and joined in a march which had been very controversial just days beforehand.
The day the Long March arrived into Derry, January the 4th, 1969, goes down in history for all the wrong reasons. The joy at seeing the marchers arrive was tainted with anger at how the police had allowed the Burntollet ambush to happen, and the rumour that some of the marchers had died there. As they gathered at the Guildhall, a massive loyalist counter-demonstration inside the walls was being held back by the RUC. Despite pleas for calm, rioting broke out on the surrounding streets, with local young Republicans taking a leading role. Violence was overwhelming the movement. Moderates were being pushed aside, and that night a group of RUC men ran riot in the Catholic Bogside.
The RUC proved finally that they either couldn't or didn't want to do their job for which they're paid, the maintenance of peace.
And it was here in the early hours of Sunday morning that people were awakened by the noise of glass smashing and doors being kicked. When they looked out, they saw police systematically break every window in the street with their batons.
And for the first time, the civil rights leaders lost control of their supporters as Derry fell into a state of virtual civil war.
There are no hooligans here, they say, only citizens defending their lives and property. And that, in a manner not seen here before, was what happened here last night.
What had started as a local campaign for the rights of a minority ended up here with the need to physically defend that minority because those in authority were failing at that. It had gone from the hope of reform to the fear of revolution and a complete disintegration of trust.
There's a feeling here on both sides, I think, that the period of conciliation is over, that something more direct, more protracted, more painful, maybe, lies ahead.
Within 6 months, British soldiers were on the streets and Northern Ireland had descended into hell. And that's why the events of 1968 reverberate still in all of our lives on this island. What started as a local protest against housing and voting discrimination led to decades of hatred and war. And it does beg one obvious question. Do you think the civil rights activists bear some responsibility for the violence that ultimately engulfed Northern Ireland?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and to a certain extent they were sorcerers' apprentices. They were conjuring up these powerful forces and they just lost control of them. They became kind of overwhelmed by them. But I think it's worth deferring to the way Martin Luther King saw things. In his letter from Birmingham jail, would you accuse someone who got robbed of being guilty? You know, it's the robber who is guilty. The activists went on the street, the activists protested, the activists were provocative, but that doesn't justify the way the police behaved. It doesn't justify the decision of paramilitaries to begin campaigns of violence. It doesn't justify the way state agencies, both from Britain and Ireland, became involved in the Troubles.
We wouldn't have had the hell that the North descended into, but for primarily, I think, the police. The police wrecked that thing. It was utterly stupid the way they behaved in Derry. Now, they were following orders from their own minister. He was stupid. He made a complete misreading of the situation.
The utter stupidity of the Unionist government and the RUC brought about the situation that they've been warning about. It became the IRA because of the Unionists. Who created the IRA and their armed struggle? The RUC and the Unionist government at Stormont. That's who. It wasn't people like me.
So the question is, right, if we hadn't asked for justice, would we have had to pay the penalty for asking for it? No. But is that a better option than living with the injustice? No. I still think it is integral to human dignity to have the right to die on your feet, fighting for what is just, than to live on your knees, putting up with what is not.
I remember when I was here in Derry a few years ago making the documentary on John Hume, and someone in the local hairdresser said to me, "John Hume, sure he started the whole troubles." And I was shocked. I mean, does standing up for your civil rights automatically threaten others who fear that they might lose their rights in return? Is it easier to keep your head down, to stay quiet? I think the consensus on this journey is that when you see discrimination or injustice, sometimes your only choice is to be brave, to stand up and to be counted. In the words of Martin Luther King, the day we see the truth and cease to speak is the day we begin to die.